All
right.
All right. Good morning, all. Welcome. Happy Wednesday, May 8th. It feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. We do this pretty frequently together. So good to see all of you. I am going to go ahead and do roll and then my usual document process here. So Don Alexander, Yolanda, Kevin.
Here.
Thanks, Kevin. Sam. Carlos. Ashley. I am striking out. Jill Cohen wrote and said she's running late, but she'll be here. Michelle.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry to interrupt, Stephanie, but somebody has started the Teams meeting. There's a Teams meeting for this, and I don't know if there are people waiting in that room or.
Yeah, Kevin, I don't know how there's a Teams. I don't have a Teams room set up.
Yeah, it came through Jennifer Isle.
Oh, that's that stupid calendar invite thing that keeps happening to me. And I don't have Teams, so I don't know how I would send a Teams invite either.
Kevin, do you see? Do you have
I can jump out and go in there and see if there's anybody in there, but
why don't you? I'm not sure what that is because I don't have it either. So
okay.
You should be able to just message folks without having to even go in the room. Like when it pops up, usually you can message it. You might just send them a Zoom link.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I know because we do it all the time. So I feel that's why I'm saying that. No judgment, but total empathy for this experience.
Pro. Okay, Jessica.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tara. Ida.
Hello.
Hello, Jennifer. I see you. Thank you.
Good morning.
Hi, Leanna.
Good morning.
Hi, Zane.
Good morning.
Good morning, Nate. Adriana. Lori. Gina, I know you're here because you gave me the Steel Magnolias quote.
Good morning.
Hi, thank you. Shauna. And Chris Menz, we know you're here because you also contributed to that conversation. Thank you. Michelle Murphy.
He doesn't seem to be bothered by his ears.
Adriana, I think you're talking about someone's ears. So you.
Sorry, good morning. Yes.
Good morning. Welcome, Margaret Ochoa.
Hi, I'm here, but I have a face for radio this morning, so I'm staying off camera.
All right, sounds fine, my friend. Sarah.
Here.
Rashawn, I know you're here because you're giving tech advice today. Thank you for your help. Casey. Kathy Wells, I know you're here. Hello. Donna Wilson.
Good morning. So I just want to solve this mystery about this calendar invite. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there is also a Teams link. So it looks like when Addie Fisher set this meeting up, it has Zoom on top, it has Teams on the bottom. So that's probably where the confusion happened.
Great. Thank you, Donna. We have some good investigators here. I appreciate it. I have no idea how to resolve this. Thank you. Kelsey Wirtz.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jade.
Good morning.
Aletha.
Present.
And I just saw Ashley Chase appear. Is there anybody's name here that I did not call?
Hey, this is Yolanda Arredondo. I'm on.
Okay, so I hear Sam is on now and Yolanda is on as well. Great.
And I did jump on a little late, so I am here as well. Ears and all.
Ears and all. Great. Thank you. All right. I think that was an interesting roll call. That was kind of fun. All right. Moving on to our meeting documents. Everyone has received the email with the links. This is going to take a little bit of time, so just bear with me. I'm going to go through meeting minutes first. There is a April 24th of 24, full group meeting minutes, training subcommittee meeting minutes, and the reporting process subcommittee meeting minutes. So I'm starting with the full group. Has everyone had a chance to review those? And are there any additions or corrections you would like to see? Okay, I see no hands, no head nods. If I could have a motion and a second to approve those meeting minutes, the group minutes, and please announce your name as you make that motion.
This is Michelle Dawsey. I'll make the motion.
This is Zane, second.
This is Jean, I'll second.
Thank you. Is anybody opposed the approval and passing those meeting minutes? Okay, seeing that. Moving on to the April 24th, 24 training subcommittee meeting minutes. This is for those of you on the training committee. Any additions that you would like to make or corrections to that document? Okay, I see no head nods, no hand raises. All right, if I could have a motion and a second from a member of the training subcommittee.
This is Aletha, I motion.
This is Sarah. I'll second.
Thank you. Is there anybody who opposes the approval and passage of the training subcommittee meeting minutes? Okay.
Stephanie, apologies. This is Margaret. You're talking about the last week of August or April, right?
April 24th.
Yes. Okay. I'm afraid I must abstain because I was not in attendance.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm sorry, did we go ahead and everybody, there were no objections to moving of those minutes? Okay, great. So we will go ahead and pass the April 24th, 24 training subcommittee meeting minutes. Moving on to the reporting process subcommittee meeting minutes. Are there any additions or corrections to that document? Okay, I see none. If we could have a first and a second, please, to approve those.
This is Michelle Dawsey. I'll make the first motion.
This is Kathy, I'll second.
Thank you. Is there any opposition to approval and passage of that set of meeting minutes for the reporting process subcommittee? Okay, seeing none, those will pass. So all those documents pass. Moving on to the meeting recap in an identical fashion. There were two documents that were provided to you. Again, a meeting recap for the training subcommittee and a meeting recap for the reporting subcommittee. I'm going to start first with the training subcommittee recap. I've already amended the dates on that. I believe it is mislabeled as April 26th. And our meeting date was April 24th. But besides that correction, are there any others from the group in the training subcommittee? All right, I see none. If we could have a motion and a second from the training subcommittee to pass that recap, please.
This is Ida. I make that motion.
Do we have a second, please?
This is Sam, I'll second.
Thank you, Sam. Is there anybody who is opposed to the passing and approval of the, training subcommittee recap? All right, I see none, so that document will pass. Lastly, I am moving to the meeting recap for the reporting process subcommittee. I have already made corrections to the date on that document. It was labeled April 26th. We are amending that to read April 24th. Are there any other additions or corrections people would like to see to that document? All right, not seeing any. If I could have a motion and a second, please. And that would be from the reporting process subcommittee.
This is Michelle Dawsey. I'll offer that motion.
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Michelle, is our first. I'm sorry, who was our second?
Gina, I'll second.
Thank you, Gina. Is there anybody who is opposed to the approval and the passage of the reporting process subcommittee recap? All right, I see none, so that will also be approved. All right, thank you. That's all my business.
All right, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Excited to jump in today. We got a 2-hour meeting, so I want to get us to our groups as quickly as I can. So I'm going to just remind us of our meetings here again with the apologies for any issues on the invite for today. We'll double check that that's not an issue going forward. So if you see any sort of like cancellations and then resend of one, it's just because we caught any sort of errors. So we'll double check that. We're back in our subcommittees today to continue the conversations from the April 24th meeting. And thanks to you all that completed the survey that we sent out in the email. Really appreciate that because that's going to be the shaping up of our meeting today. So folks that are in the reporting processes subcommittee with Doris, which I'll drop into the chat here in a second, you're going to be the ones that are hopping today to the other line. And then we'll come back at 9:45 for public comment and to close out. Y'all are continuing your conversations and you'll be going through your survey results to kind of get really clear, because at the next meeting, we're going to be coming back full group with some language and some recommendations from these groups. And so we just want to make sure that we're getting more and more clear on where you all stand so that we can move on into our next phase of subcommittees. So after today, again, we'll come back for one full group meeting around these recommendations with these directives that you see on the screen. And then we'll be moving beyond that into our new subcommittees, which will be surveying again to try and get your, where do you prefer? And then obviously some of you really appreciate folks where sometimes we just have to move you around, but we will be asking where you prefer there. So any questions around processes or kind of where things stand for now? Cool. Okay. So with that, I'm going to drop in just as a reminder, if your name is listed here, you are hopping with Doris and Jordan to the other line. And if you are not listed, you are sticking with me in the training subcommittee, and we will stay on the same line. So Jordan's going to go ahead and hop over, get it started. You'll be in the waiting room until she gets that going. And if folks are in training, just stay here and we'll get going in just a minute. Any questions for breakout?
Trace, can I just add a clarifier real quick?
Yeah, please.
So when we go into our breakouts, you're going to see that we're doing summaries of the surveys that were sent out. I put those together at 8 p.m. last night. So if you've since answered the survey, which some of you have, which is great, you're just going to see that your comments and your responses aren't reflected in that document. So I'm going to drop the reporting process Zoom link in now.
Great. So I just have one quick question. I'm sorry. Is there the link? Is there a link? Did I miss that somewhere?
Nope, I'm dropping it.
Yeah, we're gonna drop it right now.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. So if you are in the reporting processes, go ahead and click on that and we'll see you back at 9:45. All right. I think we've got everyone here's training. Looks like it. All right, cool. All right, y'all. Did anybody, not to call you out, but is anybody in that group that filled out the survey after 8 p.m. last night?
Might be, I actually can't remember, but it was in the evening. It was late. It was after other things, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
Entirely.
All right, cool.
And
So
Tracy too. I
also did it last night.
I
don't know what time I did it last night, but yeah, it happened last night. Sam.
Yeah, Sam, yours are included. I do see you in here. Roshan, yours are not. And then who else? Margaret?
Yeah, and full disclosure, mine is sitting open, incomplete. I've been traveling and then conference for the last 2 days. So yeah, I'm bad.
Oh, you're
I
good, you're
apologize.
good. Okay, so Roshan and Margaret, y'all are not in here, but Sam, yours is, just FYI.
Awesome.
Everybody else looks like you were in under the line. Okay,
Mine
cool.
isn't in there either.
Who's that?
Same here, Trace.
Gabe.
Mine is also open, waiting to be completed.
Okay, cool. So here's what we'll do. For the purposes of the conversation today, I don't think that one or two people would change any of these. Like there's a really strong, there's a couple of them that are like a little closer, and you'll see in just a minute of like, but there's nothing that's like 50-50 and we need like a tiebreaker as far as recommendations go. So I don't think it's going to shift anything, but Jade, Leanna, I'm going to give you some time at the end, just during the meetings, because I know y'all are busy, where you can just fill it out. And I just want it, so then when we do our report, we'll have some actual numbers around where folks landed. But I think for the purposes of today, we're going to go really question by question, because what I want to do is just capture the conversation around it. And I'll kind of like share with you all where folks landed, the percentages of kind of where we're at, as far as folks that did take the survey, and then the comments that were made, and we'll just open it up for discussion. So we've got, let me make sure I'm saying this right. We've got 8 questions that were sent out in the survey. So we're going to go, sorry, real quick. Donna is having some tech issues. We're going to go one by one and just make sure that we kind of understand the nuances of like your thinking, questions you might have, or things that feel really important to you to be able to capture as we write any recommendations around these pieces as it relates to training. And then, hey, Donna, you're in our group, so you're good. Okay, cool. Does that make sense to everybody? Everybody good with that? All right, cool. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you all. Actually, I've got it in PDF, so give me 1 second. I'm going to share with you the results, so you all can kind of click through with me. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
And Donna, you're good. You're in this group, right? Yeah, you're in my group. Yeah, so we're good. All right, cool. Okay. All right, so I'm going to drop this in. Y'all let me know that you can see this. And again, this is the one that doesn't include the folks that got theirs in later, haven't finished it yet. All right, y'all make sure you can access that PDF real quick. And then I'm also going to bring it up. Everybody good on that? All right, cool. So you'll see let's go one by one. And obviously, if you added comments already, I've got them captured down below. And we just love for folks to give voice to it. And I'm seeing my role a couple ways. We got 8 questions. We've got about an hour and a half. We're gonna try to just keep things moving along. And I also want to make sure that we're at the right altitude for recommendations around. So I've got a couple of ideas around like, let's not get too in the weeds on certain things, because I think from a policy perspective, we can stay at a higher level than I think where the comments tended to go. So I'll just kind of do some level setting around like, here's what we're really asking, and make sure that we're kind of coalescing around what we're trying to understand from you all. So y'all can y'all see my screen okay? Everybody's good? All right, cool. So I'm gonna read the question, talk about our results, and then just open it up for discussion. And again, we want to just make sure we're understanding your thinking on these things. Obviously, some of these are a little easier than others. So question 1, should mandatory reporters be required to complete a standardized training regarding requirements of Colorado's mandatory reporting law? 100% of the folks that took the survey said yes. And some folks got into the how often thing, which is another question later on. So I'm guessing then y'all saw that. So we won't get to the like how often yet, because we'll discuss that as its own question. And then Sam also like the kind of what like needs to be established utilizing research. I think that's also captured and further questions around like, how is this actually, like who is informing this and who is actually developing this? So we'll also hold off on that. But is there any comments that you want to make around just this idea of like should this be required, like the importance of it being a standardized training in general, before we move to the next question. All right, easy enough, y'all. Okay, I think that one's pretty straightforward. So we're all on the same page. It seems like that's where we're at. All right, question 2. Should standardized training for mandatory reporters educate participants about implicit bias and the disproportionate impacts of mandatory reporting on communities of color, under-resourced communities, and persons with disabilities? Again, 100% yes. So the question isn't should we, it's more like the how. A couple things. I think this is actually the one that received the most comments, so I want to make sure that we open this up for discussion. You know, I definitely saw, I think Donna, yours is sticking out as far as like this not being compliance, but like how are we also checking for knowledge? So I know that there was like the idea of the like check for understanding kind of like after the training piece, but there's a lot of great things in here. So I just kind of want to open this one up, like as it relates to this being inclusive. And Sam, I'm going to put you on mute. Sorry. As it relates to like this being inclusive of an implicit bias like component, what do you feel is like a non-negotiable for you that you'd want to see in a recommendation around this particular piece, or that's important to call out? And Donna, I'll start with you just because that's the one that I was like, okay, that makes sense. So like, do you have an idea of like what that actually would look like? Like what does it mean to check for understanding? Is that an additional part of the training where it's like you do this training and then we come back? And just want to make sure that I'm getting clear on like, do you have an idea? And if not, that's okay, because that can also be hashed out.
Yeah, no, I do have an idea.
Okay, cool.
So APHSA has this learning lab that they have, and I just actually wrote an e-course for them. And so when they do knowledge checks, you give so much content, and then there's going to be, you know, a question that the person has to do. So what it ensures is that a person isn't just like randomly like skimming and, you know, just like running through again to comply and just get done, but it really is, you know, pausing and checking to make sure that there is some knowledge acquisition, like people are, you know, really digging into the content that they're reading, and it may be, you know, a trick question or a question that's going to promote some critical thinking before folks can answer it.
Cool. Okay, great. Thanks for that. What else? A lot of comments here. Obviously around the, or go ahead.
Oh, sorry, this is Yolanda. I was going to say, I think one of the things that would be important to include are like the terms and the maybe like a nod to the history of why it's important that this is included in the training, like the history of the child welfare system in this country, right? And the damage, like acknowledging the damage that it's done to families, and especially historically with like boarding schools and orphan trains and things like that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a history lesson. However, it can acknowledge that there's historical damage that the system has done to families, and, you know, in a commitment to try to minimize or reduce that just those disparities and disproportionalities, like, and introduce implicit bias. So I guess what I'm saying, Tracy, is not to back away from the reality of the situation and not like try to have it be a soft introduction, have it be a realistic introduction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm hearing like the importance of just context, right? That it's not just, we're not just assuming that people understand why they're taking implicit bias training, that they also understand the context within the institution itself.
Like the context and the acknowledgement.
Yeah, love that. Thanks for that. What else from folks on here? Either a comment you already made that you want to kind of give voice to, or something that isn't captured here?
I think it's really clearly captured here. And I think based on the conversations we've already had around poverty and resources, just making sure that that's, you know, there's really a good opportunity, I think, here to be crystal clear on what the definitions are. And so when we say neglect, when we say physical abuse, what does that mean? And how are we crystal clear about that so that we're able to eliminate, you know, bias or other things that folks are associating with abuse or neglect that aren't actually abuse or neglect? And again, I think that's fully captured in the comments, but I think just continuing to call that out is really important.
Yeah, and Jane, I wonder, so like with that of like the examples you just gave, would you recommend kind of like utilizing data of like what are the most like common issues of like reporting, right? That should not have been reported sort of thing, and we're pulling those out as examples kind of thing? Or is there like a, like it's kind of like we know that the top thing that happens is like conflation of poverty versus neglect, right? And so that is our like, and we just like name that. Is that kind of like what you're getting at? Like, what are the strongest examples of like folks, implicit bias issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that's the one that is top of mind, I think, for a lot of us, is just this idea of like, how can we just very clearly name, like, neglect is X, Y, and Z. It is not A, B, and C. And so, using some of that to really be direct, like a child who doesn't have a coat, and I know the kid with the coat is the example we always use, and it's actually probably much more complex than that, but like a kid showing up at school without a coat isn't necessarily neglect. Let's talk about like, and so being really clear that like it is neglect in these scenarios, it is not neglect in these scenarios, and really helping folks to maybe, I guess maybe what I'm saying is inspire some critical thinking in the process as they're going through the training to understand like, what are the questions I'm asking myself to get at, am I coming at this from a place of what is factual, what is data, what is legal, or am I coming at this at a place from my own bias or my own, beliefs of what it should be and putting that onto someone else?
Yep. Okay, thanks for that. Sam, go ahead.
I was going to say something to that same effect. When I was doing like CPS, more family support and visitation work, I should say, I remember the training having like a literal picture of a house, a literal situation. And then we had to do the work to say, what's unsafe in this situation? What's safe? And I remember there being like a space heater. That's not the safest thing, but there's heat in the home, right? And that stuck with me because it helped you recognize how easy it was to say all the things that were wrong in the house, which were sometimes even positive things, versus when you have to list all the good things, it takes a little bit more thought. And that's the kind of thing I think it gets to that critical thinking rather than the black or white, yes or no.
Yeah, Sam, I've taken a similar where there's like literally a picture of like a home, and it's like the home is messy by like typical standards, but there's food on the table. And so are you able to like recognize, for instance, that there is like that you look at this picture and you're like, wow, this house is messy, but actually there's pictures of the family on the wall. There's like, right, like, are you able to pick out the things that like show care and needs being met, etc. So it's interesting. I'm wondering if we saw the same picture. Ida, go ahead, jump in.
I love that. I am also thinking when we're talking about poverty versus neglect, if a nod needs to be given in this directive about the order of operations, because one of the things that we've talked about along the way is that warm line, a place for people to call when they're concerned potentially about poverty. Currently, the hotline's picking up all those worries and all those concerns, and reporters are calling in simply to get help for families. So recognizing that that's not necessarily implicit bias, but that it shows up as implicit bias in the system when there's that conflation of poverty and neglect. And if there's a warm line that is established, that there should be training related to the use of that warm line as well.
Thanks, Ida. Margaret, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a couple questions as I think about framing training, because I do a lot of this training, and I'm trying to imagine it at its best elevated place. And when we talk about implicit bias, my view of the elevated best place is implicit bias discussion happens throughout the training, that it's not we've allocated 15 minutes to talk about implicit bias and take a little test and determine your own biases here. And now we're going to talk about neglect and physical abuse, sexual abuse, medical abuse, and kind of go through the training and what identifiers are. And I just wanted to kind of do a check with the group. Is that how you're envisioning this? That we're talking about implicit bias related to each and every one of these things. Like I love Aletha's comment about Mongolian spots as something that we would want to pull out in when we're talking to medical professionals about physical abuse. And we would want to talk about our potential biases with respect to poverty and when we're talking about neglect, and that it's throughout the training, it's embedded in the training. Okay, let me quit talking and let you talk now.
Yeah, what do folks think? I think I'll just say from my understanding from previous conversations that there is like it's maybe a both and, Margaret. Like I think that it's from what I've kind of gathered from this group, it's a explicit call out. And I think like if we look at the way that this is written too, like we're asking like, should participants, should there be a training that educates participants about implicit bias and the disproportionate impacts of mandatory reporting on communities of color, right? So it's not just like, yeah, one-off line that it's more, but there is like a specific section that's saying like, this is a big part that plays into all of this, right? All of these questions sort of thing. So I feel like I've kind of heard that. And I just wanted to name that on the outset that I've kind of heard from folks that it should be woven throughout. I also think that's an implementation question, and that we could state this from this group as a value, that we see this as needing to like live and breathe in each part of this training and not just as like a one-off, and I don't think we have to get into the weeds right now of like exactly what that looks like, but I think it's a good question. Are we all aligned that this is not like a section, and that once you're done with that section, we then move on?
Yeah, I agree. This is the work. And I think that's the problem that we get into. That's why we're still having this conversation in 2004. And Casey Family Programs launched this work back in the early 2000s, right? Like it doesn't sustain because folks want to continue to make this something in addition to the work versus a part of the work. So we have to figure out how to integrate this, right? Like some focus, like all of this training has to be through an equity lens. There has to be knowledge checks as we go along. There has to be a way that people can apply this knowledge into their day-to-day work. Otherwise, in 20 more years, the next group will be sitting here trying to figure out something that had already been figured out previously. Like all the tools already exist. I dropped that in there. Like we're talking about the history and orphan trains and all that. Yeah, Dr. Carol Spigner did that in 2008. She had a whole, I'm dating myself, disc on that I still have in my possession. I have no way to play this disc because I don't have anything to play it on. But, y'all, this ain't new work. This work has been around forever. And if you're like me, a DEI practitioner that's been in the field long enough, you've seen this cycle. So I'm trying to manage like all of the feels that come up for me with this. I'm like, y'all, this ain't a new conversation. Had this in 2008 when Casey Family Programs launched their disproportionality initiatives. And we have friends here from Casey Family Programs that can probably help us get these historical resources so that we're not starting over. There is no need to start over.
Yeah, I love that.
With that in mind, I said in my comment research, and I wanted to name, that was kind of my thought behind that, is we're also saying what the key research is of disproportionality, the research of these things. That was to me of like, as what this training has to include is these core research points.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing that also from just like, again, kind of thinking about the values of this group. It's like, we're not having a new conversation, but we're going to do something explicit in Colorado that like brings to light all this work that's been done long before this task force was formed, right? To actually put it into policy and ensure that it has a place where it's like front and center. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. I appreciate, Donna, your kind of call out to a specific resource too. And the disc. Yeah, mail me that disc or fax it to me if you could.
No, ma'am, this is a historical treasure that will not leave my office. I'm sure one of your friends at Casey Family can help you get your own.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Cool. Well, I think it sounds like we're all aligned. I think we've got, Kelsey, we're just going through one by one on these questions in this survey, and we're just talking about the implicit bias piece. It sounds like, I think we're all aligned here. I think what I'm hearing from you all is to like be bold in the way that we're capturing a recommendation around the importance of this, to not just be a standalone, for it to be woven throughout the training, but for it to also be explicit in the training piece, as far as like, to your point, Yolanda, like why it doesn't need to be subtle. It needs to be called out. Like, this is what it is, and this is why, and this is why it's important, and then woven out throughout the training.
This is Roshan. I feel like we're all pretty aligned in this space, but we're not the audience either, right? So I think just remembering how important the data is to help folks who might otherwise say, like, this doesn't apply to me, it doesn't matter. Like, those are the folks we want to pay attention to the training most. And so we're saying the same thing, but just remembering who the audience is too, I suppose.
Yeah.
Might not otherwise agree, there's some convincing we need to do with the training too.
Right. Yeah. Like, I appreciate the call out. It's like, let's not make assumptions about, who's taking the training, and how they're thinking about this. All right. Well, are y'all comfortable moving on? I think we've got enough to write a pretty solid recommendation here. And again, you'll have the chance in the next meeting to respond to that and shape it up. All right, let's move on. Is my screen is still shared? Okay, cool. All right, I'm moving us on to question 3. So this is around, should standardized training for mandatory reporters educate participants about the county department's process to determine which reports meet the threshold for assessment and investigation? Mostly aligned in yes. Not on the what, but the how from Aletha. Again, not I'm curious to just kind of open this up. We do have like 1 or 2 no's on this. So anybody want to jump in as far as like, thinking here, thoughts, questions you have, what you're wrestling with?
I'll jump in. I honestly can't remember if I'm one of the no's. I do think I meant to put a comment and clearly I didn't, so I could be confusing myself. My only concern is, yes, I think there should touch on education on the county's process. I do get concerned about too much education though, because I don't want, at the end of the day, I don't want mandatory reporters to feel like they're responsible for those processes. They're responsible for knowing exactly what child abuse and neglect is. The point of the mandatory reporter is to make that report to someone who has that training, who has that certification through the state. So I think in identifying biases, I think there is some benefit to some understanding in the process, but I do hesitate to like fully dive in.
Well, and I'm wondering if what you're getting at is just an explicit call out, kind of to Yolanda's point about the previous piece around the implicit bias, that the why this would be included would be an important component. It's like, we want folks to understand what your role is and what the county's role is. And once it goes to the county, here's what you should know about, what happens and what doesn't happen and how they might follow up. So I'm hearing from you just like to be sure that there's explicit guidance there. But Roshan, Margaret, and then Jade.
Thanks. This is Roshan. I was going to say something similar about the why, but I would include that the why is to help the mandatory reporter give appropriate information to the family too. So, because essentially what happens is you lose control once you've made the call, and you can't actually make a promise to the family about what's going to happen next. And I think that happens a lot where families are given bad information or wrong information. That can be scary or dangerous or just confusing. And so part of it would just be recognizing that, like, you may get a phone call, you may not, you may hear from folks, you may not. I mean, I think some of it needs to be just helping the mandatory reporter know for themselves that you don't actually predict, like, and then also being able to say that to the family so that the family has some understanding of what to expect, that's realistic and not, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that call out, Roshan, because I think that has come up in multiple conversations, is like, how do we not give bad information to families and make the situation, pitting folks against each other even more in those situations. So can definitely call that out. Margaret, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Roshan's comments there, and Adriana's and Yolanda's. And I think that providing just a bit, like not getting into, we're not training mandatory reporters to do these assessments, but I think providing a little bit of information as to what they're looking for would help smooth over rocky relationships between systems. I think that the mandatory reporting, calling out, as Aletha says, making my report, I'm doing my job here as a part of this process. But now I'm going to have a failed expectation when it hits child protection, because they're not going to do the thing that I thought they were going to do. But helping reporters understand the limitations of child protection, I think would make the process move a little bit more smoothly. But I agree, it doesn't need to be a hornbook on this. It's just a nod to it.
Thanks, Margaret. Jade, and then Aletha.
I think there's also a what to expect component of it. So I agree that I don't believe that mandatory reporters need to know all the details of everything county's going to do. And I think for them to know, what can I expect? What are the options that come out of this? What I might hear back? So I think there's just a piece of what's next.
Yeah, which would go kind of in service of the good information or the helpful information to families, that you're giving good information because you also are clear on that. Yeah. Aletha, go ahead. And then Donna.
Yeah, part of my fear when mandated reporters tell families, expect a call from CPS because I'm making a report, and then that call never manifests, you're losing credibility with that family, especially if you have an established relationship. So that's one of the fears, is telling them something that may or may not happen. And when it doesn't happen, they're looking to mandated reporters as, you don't know what you're doing kind of situation or whatever. And mandated reporters shouldn't have to know what meets criteria, because if they're sitting there and they're racking their brain about whether or not to make a report and they don't feel that it meets criteria and they don't make a report, we're losing out on a lot of history on our end, because you may not be the only reporter who has these concerns, and we're losing out on what other mandated reporters are seeing, because we can help families when we know that this is an ongoing issue and not just one silo, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. For sure makes sense. Thanks, Aletha. Donna?
So the way that I read this question was a couple ways. It calls to light to me that we are a state supervised but county administered system. And that means there could be 64 different ways that a threshold could be met. And so for me, it was really about demystifying what it is for the county that you work in. And it wasn't giving you this exhaustive list of things that meet criteria, but maybe just a couple of examples, right? Like, here are a couple of examples of cases that meet the threshold. So I don't think we need to, share all the ins and out, but I think it's important. Like, if you're a red team, if your county uses red teams because you're using differential response, it's important for a mandated reporter to know that, because your process and meeting that threshold could look a little different. So I just want us to think through that. You know, I really do think state supervised, county administered makes a big difference. And I think it creates a lot of confusion in our state. And we somehow have to let folks know that there are distinctions. You could be in Denver County and cross over to Arapahoe County when you move, and what happened in Denver may be different than what happens in Arapahoe. Doesn't mean that either system is wrong. It just means that it's different. And if we don't highlight that, I think we create more confusion for the folks that we're asking to be, you know, reporters.
Yeah, that's an important, I'm seeing a lot of head nods there. So of maybe even just, yeah, the differentiation of, yeah, or not the differentiation, the call out of just how Colorado is structured at the county, right at the county level. So appreciate that, Donna, because I don't think that has come up explicitly as being part of what this is going to say. Anything else here that you feel like is important to just highlight as it relates to this question before we kind of move on? A lot of great information here, I think, to shape up a really strong recommendation, but just want to make sure I'm not missing anything else.
I think this is one to me that where the implicit bias also is bringing up, like, you can't take back the call, right? And so having another person look at a situation is different than if you personally, who has rapport, right, are supporting the family. So I think it's important to note a second person. Once a call is made, it's more likely that a CPS is going to be involved or something to that effect, rather than, I think the tone is often, I'm making a call because I don't have enough information. And so I'm addressing my own bias rather than increasing bias. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Sorry, that was kind of all over.
No, it's good. I want to make sure, Sam. So what are you, come back to kind of what you're wanting there.
I think there's a misunderstanding that more eyes looking at a situation will make it safer, rather than more eyes looking at a situation increases bias.
Okay, appreciate that headline there. Just make sure I'm understanding. Anything else from folks for conversation here? All right, I'm going to move us on. Thank you all for that. I think some really interesting stuff to kind of pull out here. Question, wait, did I skip a question? Question 4. All right, this is the one that I don't think, okay, so I want to reframe how we're thinking about this. Okay, so the question is, which stakeholders should be included in the creation of the curriculum for a standardized required mandatory reporting training? Please list below. What I think we got wrong about the way we stated this is we don't need to create a comprehensive laundry list right now. I think what we need to create, I mean, it's helpful to have examples, which we will include in a recommendation, and an exhaustive list would inevitably probably leave someone out. So what I want to hear from you all is just more of a values of what, like what's driving the list that you might have listed here, right? So a value could be ensuring that lived experience, right, of those most impacted by the system, et cetera, are included here because they are a critical stakeholder that, historically has been not at the table. That could be one, right? So I don't want to spend too much time on just like listing out all of the pieces, but just want to hear from a higher level, again, because this is more of a policy piece of like, yeah, what's important to you as whoever the entity is that does this, that they're thinking about that as they bring that table together. Margaret, go ahead.
So I'm not going to name the stakeholder because you guys can do that better maybe, but the value that I really want to make sure is captured for school staff, because remember I'm in the Office of School Safety, is someone who can speak to the dynamics of sexual offending, who can speak to power control, so that they can identify sexual abuse and grooming behaviors. That doesn't mean we need an educator at the table. It means somebody who can speak to those problems so that sexual abuse can really be just fleshed out in a way that makes sense to them, so that when they're seeing it, they can identify it and make a report.
Appreciate that. And Roshan, or Margaret, that's a good reminder that, each one of you is like representing a different entity. So this is a good opportunity for like, from your perspective and your unique, where you sit in your organization or wherever, that you're kind of speaking to like ensure that that value is like seen in the lens of like who's helping create this. Leanna, go ahead.
I think, kind of similar to this task force, it's important that there are people with lived experience in the system, both people who have experienced it as parents and also as children. It's just really important that they're a part of developing that training. And I put that in my response that was submitted late.
Appreciate that. Looking at that now. Thank you.
Roshan, are you going to talk or do I need to?
You start, Margaret. I'll jump in after. You go first. You go.
I just want to talk about how we're going to manage confidentiality with respect to advocacy for sexual assault and domestic violence survivors. We've got to have those people at the table to ensure that we are improving the lives and preventing and protecting those victim survivors instead of making things worse for them.
Roshan, anything to add to that? Just because I know, and then Adriana, I'll come to you.
No, just yeah. I mean, I appreciate it. I was gonna add, I think again, hopefully we shift who's reporting towards the, at some point in this process. So, but even if we do, I still think DVSA, those community-based advocates should be part of the training at some point. And I would just continue to say, it has to be evidence-based. It has to be community-focused. And again, I think I've raised this a couple times, but just from our own experience in the last few years, this is the part that scares me the most, because like we know what evidence-based DV research looks like after 50 years of research. We also know there's people who've done one study on parental alienation and are like, here's what I'm going to talk to you about. And then if their voice is loud enough, it gets balanced as if these are both equally evidence-based. So I worry a lot about like who gets to be the trainer or who gets to review. So I want this absolutely, and I think that if we, I'm not quite sure how to say like get it right, but it scares me because like call us before you approve anybody. I'm not sure what we can offer, but the state coalitions, there are people who are like professional organizations in the field that have both evidence and direct service work, that's who they're representing, and folks with lived experience. So yeah, that's my big concern.
Yeah, and Roshan, like we can certainly, because I'm seeing some head nods too around this idea that like, this task force can be a continued resource as these recommendations are potentially picked up and fleshed out and, implemented. That, to see this group as a unique table of professionals that have been having an eagle eye on this issue for 2 years, and that we would recommend that whatever entity is working on XYZ, in this case, this particular training, that you utilize the expertise of this group, because we have had these conversations. So that I think can be part of the recommendation more broadly. Adriana, then Donna.
Okay, I'm going to struggle with how to phrase this. I am concerned. At the heart of this, I do absolutely support having all stakeholders involved. I absolutely support doing training on, bias in reporting. I do want to make space for that. My primary concern with training, though, and I say this as a legal profession, so, I see this through my lens, We in the state of Colorado, I believe, have not done a good job in educating mandatory reporters what is their legal requirements. And at the end of the day, while I want to include all of these pieces in the training, I don't want it to be so overwhelming. I don't want to have the perspective so broad that mandatory reporters walk away not with the clear understanding of what their legal obligations are. And so I feel like the more people that we involve, not that I don't want to be inclusive and not that I don't wholeheartedly support that as an objective and requirement, but I am only concerned that the more people that we involve, the more that we talk about these other elements, the further we get away from mandatory reporters having an understanding of what they are required to do under the law at the end of the day. That, to me, at least, it is the top piece in providing this education. Again, I say that knowing, that's, as a legal profession, that's my lens, but I don't know how to, I struggle with how to blend the both. Because again, I want all these voices at the table. I want people to talk about their lived experiences and what happens when we get it wrong, but I don't want to scare or distract mandatory reporters from their primary understanding of what they have to do in these situations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hear that, at least I don't hear that to be in conflict where you're just like, I just want to ensure that in addition to all of these components that folks are highlighting as a priority, that there's also just an explicit call out of like, and what I think we've been kind of getting at is like that there's an explicit call out of like what the law says, right? And that is a part of people's understanding of what the training is. So I don't see those two in conflict. I hear your concern about, when you bring all these people to the table, does it get watered down? But I don't think I'm hearing anything from this group or this task force overall that would be something that would be, if anything, it would be more clear around what does the law say and what does the law not say, and that these are additional components as far as like making a report with with better training, right? So I don't know. I'm curious if other folks have that same concern, but definitely like just appreciate that call out, Adriana, and can ensure that from the group perspective that we're just naming that's still an important part of this, that people understand what the law says.
Yep.
Donna, go ahead, jump in.
And I think it's a both and, it's not an either or. I think we have to move beyond the compliance space and what, Adriana is saying in terms of letting people know what mandated reporters are required to do. That to me stays stuck in compliance. Compliance is what continues to have disparate outcomes in our system. So we have to figure out a way to blend them both. But I wanted to go back to Rashawn's comment about evidence-based practices, and I dropped it in the chat. Evidence-based practices are not often normed on the very populations that we're talking about. So we can't be stuck. That it cannot be a one-size-fit-all that we're only going to use evidence-based practices when they are community-based programs that have shown that they are just as effective, if not more, because they are rooted in the community that they are serving. So we have to figure out a way to blend both in our system. We cannot just rely on the evidence because the evidence leaves people on the margins sometimes. And that's from a researcher.
No,
I'm
it's
saying
100% true. Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment. And there's this balance, like we want community and we want what's working in community, but we want what's working in community and what people say they need. It gets lost, depending on who's making the decisions. And so it's really about the decision makers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like, I want Donna to pick.
Well, the thing that I can't wrap my head around is we keep dumping tons of money in these evidence-based practices that have not been normed in the populations that we're trying to make them serve. Make that make sense. It does not make sense to continue to put all of our eggs in one basket and then wonder why we still have disparate outcomes. We still have disparate outcomes because it doesn't fit for that population. So we have to figure out a way. Like, I value science. I got a PhD for a reason. I value research. However, I value it when it's used appropriately. So we have to move away from equality and get back to equity. Equity is giving everybody what they need in order to succeed, not everybody gets the same thing. And I think some counties are stuck on that. We gave all these families the same thing. Well, guess what? That's why you're getting the results that you're getting, because it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this dialogue because like the reason I use that term and I have similar concerns about it is, again, and I have this very specific CFI stuff in my head because we've been working on it so much. But again, there's years of practice and research and community, you know, and then there's a couple of studies and that aren't very strong studies, and then in fact they get lifted up as equal, and all of the community work goes out the window, and people are like, oh well, these people are really loud, so this must be just as important. So yes, I know, I just appreciate the dialogue because this is the hard part, right, is making sure that folks hear. Like, I know it when I see it and I'm not sure how to tell you. I don't know. So yeah, thanks, Donna. I always appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that dialogue. And Donna, just going back to your like the both and comment, I think that applies to a lot of this conversation, right? It's like calling, like Adriana, to your point, you know, it's saying like, let's not lose sight of the fact that there is a law and we want people to understand and all the things that we're saying, right? So it's just calling us back to this kind of both and space. So just appreciate y'all kind of speaking up for what your both ands are so that we can capture all of those hopefully comprehensively. All right, y'all, I'm gonna keep us moving. I think that's a super great conversation around this piece. Obviously, it's like some of that stuck within this question, but I also think it's kind of more broadly some of these values piece here. All right, so we are on 5 because I went, okay. So this is an interesting conversation. I really want to get into this because this was the one that we were most split on, both from the survey, but also in our previous conversation. I was actually surprised based on our previous conversation that this is where the survey went, which I don't think is a bad thing. I'm just like, oh, okay, cool. So I just want to, Yolanda, I think I'm actually maybe going to start with you on this one because I appreciated your comments in both in the survey, but also in previous conversations around what already exists. And so I just want folks to be able to kind of poke and prod and ask questions so that we can get more clear on kind of what you're saying as far as how this makes sense for CDHS. So the question is, subcommittee has discussed which entities should be responsible for administering the standardized training for mandatory reporters. Possible entities are listed below. So we listed like, I think like 4 or 5 or something. And these were the top 3. So it's a split between, you know, Department of Regulatory Agencies, DORA, or CDHS. So Yolanda, just want to hear, you know, you're saying CDHS already has this online mandatory reporting training that hundreds of community members take each year. I want to hear from you, like just a little bit more voiceover if possible, if you're cool with me putting you on the spot. And then I think like, let's just start with the CDHS conversation. And then I want to hear from the kind of DORA folks, and then just like what concerns or questions you have. And let's just kind of bat it around a little bit. Because I think this is one that we can, yeah, that there's probably different perspectives on, but Yolanda, I want to give you a chance first.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I just wanted to call out, by no means is it maybe as comprehensive as it could be, or as, you know, it's not perfect by any means, is we do have a 2-hour online mandatory reporter training that's on our Code for Kids site that we do have a lot of people take every year, because it is really targeted at trying to build just a foundation of information and knowledge if you are a mandatory reporter and you're seeking, and you're like no one ever told me that, or maybe I just found out that I am that and I want to know what it is, you know, that I'm supposed to do. So I think it's just important for folks to be reminded, if they didn't already know, that there is that online training, and it's maybe there are components of it that really do resonate with people as being relevant to something we're trying to build into the future. And maybe there's other components of it that are clear examples of like what we don't want to continue perpetuating around implicit bias, or around like how not to do things. So I think it's in that way, I think it could be a tool. I also think it's in looking at the choices, I think what the challenge is, because it's fair criticism around the Colorado Department of Human Services, right? Being part of the issues that, you know, we find ourselves here in this task force discussing, And at the same time, I think that it's also another thing though to have like some of that insight we've learned in from between the county administered state supervised system of like what we would like to see work better throughout that. So it's an interesting question. Sorry, trying to formulate my thoughts. It's an interesting question because I do think it makes sense. You know, of course, I'm biased around that. I work for CDHS. So, of course, I'm thinking all of the ways that we could improve upon the ability to train mandatory reporters across the state, especially if there were more considerations like in a statute or another task group or something like task force, something like that, to really explore all the things that we've been discussing here even further. The worry I think I have about regulatory agency is that a good portion of mandatory reporters aren't part of any regulatory agency. It's based on their employment by which they are a mandatory reporter, not by their licensure. So when I think of regulatory agencies, I think of licensure. I think of the physicians. You know, that doesn't apply necessarily to somebody who does eligibility for women, infants, and children or SNAP benefits, right? I'm not sure that those staff people are regulated by a particular regulatory agency or have to register with DORA, for example. So I don't know if the idea of having it be through a regulatory agency is more aligned with different states that really only focus the training and the attention on mandatory reporter on a few of those like high value categories, like physicians and medical personnel and teachers and the ones that could be more directly involved in a regulatory agency, if that makes sense. Because there were some states that have probably lots of mandatory reporter categories and they really only focus the state laws on the top types that are licensed and probably easier to regulate around compliance. You know, there's that word again, compliance of having taken the training. Right, like that. So that's just was part of my opinion why I didn't select anyone else than CDHS, because I think it's hard when you have so many diverse mandatory reporter categories in Colorado.
Thanks, Yolanda. I'm wondering actually, since we have the data to suggest the majority of folks, you know, like what's the phrase? Not letting the imperfect be the whatever of good. Oh, geez. Okay. Well, so not getting caught up on so we have the data to say, okay, majority of you are in the CDHS house. I wonder if actually, or in the CDHS camp, what makes most sense here. So I wonder if actually, with those comments, Yolanda, you're making me think that actually let's talk here around with the CDHS recommendation here of the entity, what would need to be true for you to feel good about that, right? So knowing the concerns that you all have shared, baked into a recommendation of like, yes, CDHS makes most sense from a systems perspective and all the things, Yolanda, you just named, right? Like assuming that those things are all true for folks, generally speaking, even if you don't love it, because you have these concerns, what would need to be true? A commitment to this kind of I'm going to throw out an example. Ida, your comment about cross-entity work to ensure compliance administration. So yes, you're housing this mandatory training within CDHS. However, you know, there has to be a cross-entity committee, right, that CDHS holds, but brings in all these other folks into this conversation. I'm just throwing out something as an example of where I could see this going. So I just want to open it up to you all around what would need to be true for this to feel good, given the kind of concerns that some of you all shared and that Yolanda referenced, which is really from the previous conversation in April. Sam.
I was hoping someone smarter would start, but I think for me, the biggest thing is the nuance of areas. So the concern for a teacher is different than the concern for a doctor, is different than the concern from a faith leader. And so having it within DHHS, I think, doesn't give you those nuanced examples and that nuanced experience when you're seeing a family every day versus a one-off. So that's where, in my mind, DHHS is maybe doing like the law and the process, but there's those examples that we talked about with bias and why we have the disproportionate representation we have. That for me is going to be better if the entity actually, that they're consistently working with that population, is helping support that portion of the training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it might go to ensuring that on the compliance side of the entity side, that there's representation across all these like different mandatory reporters and the different nuances that are present. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, so in my mind, it's like DHHS is doing the basic, and then there's 2.0 or part 2 that might maybe still be within DHHS, but it's unique to your situation or your role.
Yep. What else? And maybe folks aren't feeling super opinionated about this, and you can say that too. I mean, we asked the question, so you had to give an opinion, but maybe you're like, listen, let it lie where it lies, and let's actually focus on like what it is. Kind of curious, just trying to get a pulse on what y'all. All right, there we go. All right, Margaret, and then Leanna.
So I love the partnerships that Human Services have developed with the Kemp Center, with Illuminate, with other nonprofits that are expert in the field, and would love to see DHS continue to network and establish strong relationships with other experts who can improve the training and address the concerns that we are raising in the mandatory reporting task force writ large. I just think that the work is really good, and kind of to Donna's point, the work's been done. Let's not recreate it. Let's go in and make it the best it can be.
Appreciate that, Margaret. So just an underscoring of like, I mean, it sounds like there are some of those relationships that already exist. And so highlighting, some of those partners and ensuring that they have a spot at the table for this in an ongoing way. It's kind of what I'm hearing from you. Is that an appropriate way to summarize that?
Even better than what I said, and I really would love to be attributed with that comment.
Perfect. Okay, great. It's all yours. Leanna, and then Jade.
So the question that I have about CDHS being the one to administer the training is, if CDHS is holding the mandatory reporters accountable for the training, who is holding CDHS accountable for making sure that they are complying with that? Because I've said this before, but DHS is part of they're a big part of the problem. The mandatory reporting is a pipeline into a bigger systemic issue. And DHS, and I'm no disrespect to people on this task force who work for them, but as a system, they have perpetuated a lot of the harm that we are brought on this task force to address. Like, the disparate outcomes are coming from that agency and the work that they're doing. And so I struggle with putting this completely in their hands to administer the training and make sure that people are complying with it. And I think, to your question, Trace, about what would need to happen, my question is, who's overseeing DHS to make sure that they are implementing this as it's being designed and with the intent and the carrying it out to match what the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, which is to bring equity to the system as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Leanna. Yolanda, I'm just kind of curious your perspective. Obviously, I'm not trying to say like, so what's the answer, but thoughts there, like, do you have examples of like what that might look like now in other systems of accountability? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting question, because the idea of disparate outcomes, I'm just curious Are you talking about disparate outcomes of impact to families? Because I think that's where, for me, I go into the state supervised county administered system as far as child welfare, the administration of child welfare services. So if we're talking about outcomes, there's kind of dual responsibility with counties and the state as well. We're talking about the responsibility for mandatory reporters. So there is no regulation of mandatory reporters of child abuse and neglect right now. So even the online training is like, if you are curious, interested, would like to know more, here's an opportunity and a tool for you to use. There's no expectation unless an agency builds one in for anyone to even take that training. So it's really on a voluntary basis. And I think what we're talking about is establishing some of those expectations, if not regulations or requirements, right, by potentially law, that people would then have to go through that training. And so if we're talking about that, I think the same question could apply to regulatory agencies. Like the same questions that you posed about CDHS, who would do that with regulatory agencies? Right, in the same, I mean, it's a fair question. I'm not arguing with the fairness or the validity of the question. It's a fair question, right? And I think for CDHS in particular, the sort of the accountability partners are the community at large and the governor's office, right? Who ultimately is over all of the departments across the state, the Department of Early Childhood, the Department of Human Services, all the different departments across the state. The governor's office is over us. So that's the accountability, and the governor's office is beholden to the constituents of Colorado. So, I mean, that's how I answer that question. And I know that that's not probably the answer that people want to hear. When I think about it, though, I think like there's a lot, rightfully so, there's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of accountability, and there's a lot of attention paid to the Colorado Department of Human Services, and when we get things right and when we get things wrong. And so I think that's why you see task forces and why you see, the emphasis on people with lived experience informing our policies and informing the implementation of those policies. And because that's who ultimately like we're accountable to is the communities across Colorado. Yeah, so I'm not sure how better to answer that question. I think it's an important question for us to wrestle with, and that's my best attempt to like just try to address some of those concerns.
Yeah, Yolanda, I appreciate that. It's a sticky question, right? So I appreciate you just kind of talking through how you all are thinking about that. I think, Margaret, you're actually kind of going where I was headed, which is the Ombudsman's office obviously plays a unique role in accountability. And I wonder, Leanna, I'm going to pick on you just since it was your question. Do you have a suggestion of like, just because here's like my outsider perspective, just because that is the way that accountability has typically worked, doesn't mean that this group could not recommend that there be a stronger line of accountability to this particular piece of the system, right, as a whole, because the accountability, right, that's why this task force was formed, right? Like, is this accountability piece. And so I'm just wondering if you have like, are you wanting to see like an explicit recommendation around an entity of accountability that could be the Ombudsman office, that could be like a specific call out, or are you just wanting to call it out generally speaking? Like, my concern is that if we write a recommendation around accountability that just says accountability is important, then that's a value and not like a recommendation, right? And so like, do you have a recommendation, or does anybody else have a recommendation around what you think that accountability could be more explicitly?
And I don't really have an answer. I mean, I guess I'm not looking for a specific recommendation. It's just kind of a question. And I think Yolanda did a good job of answering it. And, Margaret's point is taken as well. I just think that, there are a lot of different perspectives that people bring to this conversation. There are a lot of people in the community who have been impacted by the system, who have no trust in DHS, who have no trust in the Ombudsman's office because of the ultimate outcomes from child welfare cases, not just the mandatory reporting side, but kind of the full spectrum of what goes on in a case and the disparate outcomes at every stage. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. I don't necessarily have an answer, and I don't think it's something that needs to be explicitly delineated in whatever the recommendations are. I just think it needs to be considered when we are making this decision. And I don't really think that, Dora, it makes sense for them to be administering the training. So I'm not necessarily saying that it should be one of these other agencies. I just think it needs to be kind of taken into account.
Totally. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate you kind of clarifying, like, yeah, just, again, it's like, it's a thing to wrestle with. So do you have a perfect answer on the who then? No, but, yeah, that's something I could work with kind of Jordan on too, around how we write this, an explicit call out. Jade, and then anybody else that wants to kind of jump in.
Thanks, Trace. I think my suggestion is a combination of my answer to several of these questions, but generally my opinion is I do believe CDHS is the right one to develop the training in terms of like some of my recommendations earlier around crystal clear around definitions of abuse and neglect and kind of how decisions are made and next steps and processes. I do feel like that generally fits in CDHS's wheelhouse and they're the one to create it. And I agree with this question around accountability. And so what was coming up for me was this like stakeholder question above. I'm not sure that, and actually let me clarify, CDHS doesn't have to be the one to create it. I think it could go through a CEMP or, an outside entity but CDHS I think makes sense to be the ultimate owner of it. But I'm really kind of leaning into the idea in my head of a multidisciplinary or multi-sector or multi-stakeholder oversight or review board, probably similar to the makeup of this task force that looks at that training maybe as much as twice a year, does the initial review and then does like a biannual review and looks at feedback, looks at legislative changes, looks at, accountability for how's it getting, are people taking it? What are they not taking it? And so in my head, I think it's generally lives in CDHS, that there's some sort of review board that reviews it annually, that includes all those stakeholders, that moves forward the accountability, that holds the accountability, but also kind of keeps it updated, keeps it like overviews compliance, keeps it fresh and real.
Jade, getting a lot of love from the task force right there. So could be an interesting recommendation. I think we kind of touched on this earlier. Can't remember what it was now, but around like a recommendation around how you could continue to utilize this kind of task force, whether it's right, like in an ongoing way. Obviously, this is like a part of the like the ombudsman is the sponsor of this task force, but this task force doesn't necessarily need to end. It could end in the like monthly. We're on quite the sprint right now with the directives, but like that this could then turn into sort of a what do you call it, an advisory board or I'm curious to hear like what do folks think about something like that
I think
as it
that
relates
would
to
be
this
great.
training, but also more broadly. Sorry, Donna, go ahead.
No, I think that would be great. I just wanted, I have a question. So this specific task force is slated through December 2024. Is that correct? Is that when our charge ends? Okay. And then, some sort of advisory or oversight committee. I love that, Jade. I think that is a brilliant idea and something that we probably should have had a long time ago. So yeah, it's great.
Yolanda, I mean, I know obviously you all have like community partners and those sorts of things, but would that be a unique, from your perspective, like, is that a unique value add in a way that could, come alongside the department and some of these, things so if CDHF, obviously we're talking just about the training thing and this would probably apply more broadly, but I'm kind of curious, are you like, yo, that already exists? Or you're like, okay, yeah, that sounds interesting. And I know I'm not trying to like say like you speak for the department and this is an official answer, but I'm just kind of curious, generally speaking, thoughts there.
I think it would be great. I mean, we do have a very small version called our training steering committee. However, that's like a work group of our child welfare sub policy advisory committee, and it's mostly counties, some community or stakeholder agencies, and then the Division of Child Welfare from the state. And so it's, I think, probably limited in its influence and in its representation. So I think something that's a little bit more coalition building and broader in scope as far as participants would be great. Like I would have, not only would I not have an objection, I would wholeheartedly support that.
Cool. Love that.
Especially if
right.
we're going back to that, sorry, especially if we're going back to that idea. I love the idea that was posed about, there are some key elements that are consistent and need to be standardized across any mandatory reporting category of information, especially that legal responsibility definitions. And then there are the unique circumstances. If you're a firefighter, or if you are somebody who does eligibility for WIC, or whatever's the type of mandatory reporter you are, you're going to need, I think, the nuance. I think that's how it was described, like the nuances of those scenarios and those situations. And that's where I think an advisory board could also really help. Like, how do you build a training that has maybe, the first half is all everybody's the same, and then it's kind of a choose your own path kind of, or choose your own door kind of a thing, depending on the type of category of reporting party. Like that sparked that idea, as well as I'm hearing people's feedback. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate that. Leanna, I'm wondering, and then I'm going to move us on. Is that like that kind of idea seems like it might get at your kind of concern around accountability and accountability not being able to, at least currently, be able to fit squarely in one entity, right? Because like the example of the ombudsman, you're like, well, that could also be problematic, right? So this is more like we've got more eyes more generally on something, and accountability looks like community accountability in this case, or like coalition accountability. Is that something that is like more appetizing to kind of the challenge you were raising?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I think it kind of speaks to the question further along in the survey about, updating the training and making sure that it's like we're amending it, we're reviewing it on a regular basis, and that all of the stakeholders that are involved in developing it, not again, like not specific people or specific entities, but like generally speaking, representation in who's developing the training should also be represented when the training is being reviewed and updated as time goes on. To Donna's earlier point, like we don't want to be having this same conversation in 20 years. And so I think that having all those people at the table in some way, shape, or form is important on a recurring basis. And I like the idea of the advisory board.
Cool. Love that. All right. I'm going to move us on. We've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to more tightly facilitate us through these questions. Next one is, should mandatory reporters be required to take standardized training on a recurrent basis? Most folks said yes, so we're going to move forward with this as a yes. What is top of mind for you of like, obviously there's the questions around the like 2 versus 3 years. I would love to hear if somebody feels super strongly there. I don't know that there's like a super strong science other than it needs to be on a recurring basis, right? So I don't know that we need to get into I think that could be something that, again, the folks that actually do this, that when you bring those experts to the table to develop this training, could be considered there. So I don't know that we need to get into those details right now, but I'm curious. Yeah, what are folks' thoughts here? What's top of mind for you? Roshan, go ahead.
In my late night answers that you can't see, I had said that this might be an opportunity to sort of rotate. So like if this, and I don't want to say basic, but this sort of introductory training to the things we've been talking about so far are required in the first year or 2 years or first 2 cycles or something like that. And then if people stay in the field and continue, then maybe they could choose to learn more about, sexual assault in depth, or, child sexual abuse in depth. And so there may be some options for choosing to kind of widens people's knowledge over time. I don't have that fully fleshed out as like this would actually work, but I like the idea of people getting, this core content that we're talking about, but then also being able to really think deeply about what are the unique pieces that, I as a teacher or I as a therapist, I'm seeing in my practice or in my work every day.
I love that. Thanks, Roshan. Jaden and Margaret.
I love that idea. I think my worry about this being an annual, like I'm picturing an annual online training that takes a couple of hours. And while I do think that should be mandatory and people should have to do it, I worry that we'll be in a similar situation to what we're in now, where people just like skip through it. Like you take it once and then after that, it's just like, how do I get this over with? And they aren't really critically thinking about it anymore. And so I like the idea of like maybe some sort of like evolution or some sort of levels of it, or like every 3 years you take the basic one, but in years 2 and 3, you can take a deeper dive, or I don't know. I think there's something around how to keep it relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. Margaret, go ahead.
Yeah, and I put in the chat, we really need to codify this. I don't disagree with anything that, any of the comments that Jada Rashan made. I think those are good ideas. But we do need to put in statute exactly what we mean, because I can't tell you how many calls I get just in my office. So I can't imagine how many others of you are getting these same calls. How often do we need to do this? And the statute for schools says periodically. So we just need some guidance, because I don't want to have schools out of compliance with the requirement because there's no clear requirement. So we need to make it clear. You know, when we have an online option available, it's really tempting to just, throw everybody at that. That I think it's something we could consider is new reporters or someone who has stepped into a role as a reporter in the last year have to do an in-person training, and people that are veteran reporters can do something online. But I've never had even 20-year veterans in schools tell me that they felt like one of my trainings was a waste of time. They have always said to me, boy, I learned something new today. And, it might be because, oh, now medical abuse is a type of abuse. Did you know that that's kind of a new thing? Things change in the law, and it's important for them to be up to date. It's important for them to get those reminders. I feel strongly about this, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, I'm wondering if folks, obviously there's like the implementation side, so let's put that on the shelf just for a minute. I'm curious, like, Margaret, I think that's a really specific example or suggestion around, like, if you were a new reporter, you need to go in person and you need to like, right, you have this longer, or this more intentional training. If you are someone who's doing this on the recurring basis, after your initial training, you can take this online training, but it is recurring sort of thing. Like, what are folks' reactions to something like that? Does that get at, Ida, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the sheer volume that we're talking about when we are pointing at mandatory reporters in Colorado. It's quite a lengthy list in the current training that we have. And I think that this is happening yearly for a lot of different professions. I think especially teachers, we see the numbers going up in August, especially, but there are over 15,000 people who take the online training every year. And so just remembering the volume that we're talking about, I think the scale of it is an important thing to think about when we're making recommendations for the standardized training. I think I initially had put that I wanted this annually, and then I saw the three-year recommendation. So I was sort of trying to settle into the middle. But the more I think about it from an accountability standpoint, I think annually makes the most sense. And the reason for that is just for the very virtue of what we've been talking about, that when you're trying to track not annually, it gets really dicey in the data. And I think it can be more of an administrative burden to do a biannual type of tracking, since we'll be having them some agency will be administering and taking care of this.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's like by trying to lessen it, you're actually creating more kind of tracking where it's like, okay, you did that in 2022, so you're up in like versus just like annual training. Okay, Sam, and then I'm gonna, as it relates to this, I think we can, after this, we can move on to the other questions, because really it's just like, should this be recurring? And then, to the other points, like the advisory board, the kind of cross entity piece could continue to kind of hash out what unique challenges might come up from an implementation side and how to address that. So I don't want to get us too caught here. Sam, go ahead, and then I'm going to move us to the next question.
I don't know where I put it in my answer, so it's kind of a repeat, but I think it's important to do regularly from that research standpoint. And so that's the piece to me. You have this initial onboarding that's legal and implicit bias, but really understanding the trends, I think, is the piece to me. Every year you're looking at, these are the different trends, these are the disproportionate outcomes. So you're keeping it front of mind, the people involved, rather than the compliance of the task. That's to me what that ongoing looks like. Obviously, there's the basics if there's legal changes and process changes, but really the focus is to keep people mindful of the impact of your choices.
Thanks, Sam, for that. All right, the next question I'm going to actually breeze through because I think that we've addressed it quite a bit just in this conversation, which is, should the standardized training for mandatory reporters be reviewed and if necessary amended on a recurring basis? Seems like a resounding yes, and there's a couple of good points in here around like what that review could look like or what it could contain. So the disparity data for the state and county, because that's shifting, changing, ongoing, right? So I'm seeing that. And so Sam, I'm kind of hearing the same in yours. The data focused on trends and personal stories portion should be updated annually, and then annually reviewed to ensure any changes in laws are reflected too. So like also just the compliance piece of that is like ensuring that the training is reflective of like what the reality is. So I think we have enough here to, it seems like this is important to you all. And obviously this kind of depends on like the actual like cadence of the training itself. But that whatever that cadence would be, it needs to be ongoing and reviewed there too. Everybody comfortable with that? Okay. All right. So this last question, so for applicable professions, so again, we're talking specifically here, should a state authority be able to withhold licensure and or certification for failure to complete the standardized training? Majority of y'all said yes. Anybody want to speak to the no piece here? Mostly just want to understand. We're gonna go with the yes piece just from the data standpoint, but just want to make sure we're understanding the nuances of what you all are naming here as maybe a concern or question or what you want to make sure is top of mind.
I'll jump in. I said yes, and I think it's come up several times into my comments as well, is how do we hold accountable those who don't have a regulation group? I think that's the question here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something to just note. I can note that to our team of like, we're getting at the directive as it's written here by just saying yes, like that there should be accountability here, but that does leave the question of like, what is the accountability for folks that are not professionally licensed? And is that being addressed elsewhere in the directives or task force? So can certainly raise that. As it relates to this piece on like being able to revoke or what was the language, withhold, any concerns or questions that folks want to make sure that we're addressing here in any recommendation? Seems like folks are aligned mostly. It's like we can't require a training and then be like, oh, but if you don't do it, that's okay. Margaret?
Sorry, couldn't unmute. I just like the idea of letting them decide what they want to do. I mean, there's just it feels like it's very loose. So the state authority can do what they want with that information. But I agree with you that a mandate with no teeth is hardly a mandate.
Thanks for that. All right, any other
I would just quickly, sorry, I would just quickly add, I think what my first reaction was like, oh, that's a big, like, I don't get my license if I don't take a 2-hour training. Like my first reaction was kind of like, that's huge. And then on the other hand, I was like, well, the consequences for families of a report that isn't, that is racist or is, any of these other things are huge. And so therefore, I feel like I swung myself back to the consequences for a professional to not take the training should also be huge.
Yeah, Jade, I feel like I've heard folks wrestle too in these conversations similarly, where it's like, well, that feels like a lot. And then it's like, well, but also this group is saying that the prioritization here is the safety of kids and families and putting that above and putting that into baked into someone's professional responsibility. Like it is your responsibility to understand why this is important and why it's important to do it, to understand it well. Right.
The outcome of a bad report could be me losing my kids. Like there should be a pretty that's bigger than any professional thing, in my opinion, that could be an outcome for families. So that's kind of where the process I went through in my head.
Yeah. I feel like I've heard similar kind of struggles with folks which appreciate that. Roshan? You're on mute. Yeah.
Sorry. I said yes too, and I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to note, I really want to make sure that with this recommendation, we create some infrastructure around it. Like, is there a database? And I know we don't have to answer all that today, but one thing I want to be thoughtful about again is, again, as everybody knows, there are folks I hope we remove from these, but we will, I don't know that we'll get to the, has anybody heard that? I don't know, just in case. But surprise, no. But whatever we do, I don't think we'll get to the place where it's only licensed folks. And so it will inevitably fall on very small nonprofits to manage this in some way. And so having like a database to check into or something that's easy and clear will be helpful, because what I don't want to do is add burden to programs. I want this done. I want the accountability, but I think we want to make it as easy as possible so that the programs or the folks who are doing this accountability have an easy and clear way to do it. And it's not an extra burden or it's something that they get confused and do wrong. So I just want to make it easy, and there's some infrastructure pieces to add.
Yeah, and an eye on unique implementation challenges, I think is what I'm hearing. Cool. All right. I thought this was such a great discussion. I really appreciate y'all going through each of these. A lot of really great points to pull out, and appreciate too. Sometimes it's like, I think that values question is really important, where it's like, why are we saying this is important versus getting too lost in the details piece. So I think we did a really nice job of kind of ebbing and flowing between the two, which are equally, if not more important. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Margaret, nice to see your face. Not a face for radio. I don't know what you're referencing there, but
yeah, it's just I feel like it's a Monday morning since I've been traveling. I got up and did my workout, and I was like, oh, I'm going to see my family on mandatory reporting task force so they can see my face.
Yeah, right. We're all family here now. Oh man, love that. All right. Anything else? Are folks feeling good about this conversation? Just kind of general pulse check, feeling like we had a fair discussion and kind of got through a lot of the cool. All right. Really appreciate it. We've got a lot of work to do on our side of like actually shaping these conversations up into recommendations. So just want to name to you all, know we're all busy, but there hopefully there's an opportunity between now and the next meeting to respond to something before the meeting. But if there's not, we will ensure that you have actual review time in the meeting itself, which honestly might be our best bet at this point, is like, let's not pretend that everybody can do their homework and let's actually come to the meeting and say, all right, you've got 30 minutes to review this and write all your questions down, etc. And then we'll come back. So that's most likely what is going to happen, just a FYI there. So, all right, y'all, I'm going to let folks back in. We'll do a quick call for public comment and then we'll get you on your way. Thanks. All right, y'all, welcome back. Trusting, you had a great conversation in the other reporting processes committee. Really appreciate folks' time today. Real quick, just want to, I have not seen a request for public comment, but just want to name that here. If there is a member of the public on the phone or online that would like to make public comment, we do have time now for the whole task force to be listening. So if you're out there, please drop me a line or come off mute and let me know. I'll give that just a minute. Oh, I'm still sharing screen. Thanks, Doris.
No problem.
Wow, everybody was just gonna let me look like that, huh?
I got you. They
Thanks,
don't
Doris.
got you. I got you.
You're all right. Appreciate that. All right, seeing none, seeing no requests for public comment. So just as a reminder, we got a lot of work to do between now and the next meeting to shape up these conversations into recommendations, which is our commitment to you. And then we will make sure that we have ample time for review and conversation around that. Jordan, I was saying in my group, I want to just check with you. I'm guessing that the most efficient way to do this is to actually have time in the meeting itself for the review of those recommendations to then respond to, because we know that not everyone is able to review, but I'm guessing from a timeline perspective, we won't. Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, we'll do our best to draft some preliminary recommendations based on the 2 different subcommittees discussions today. It would be extremely helpful if folks could do a little bit of pre-research and just pop in and look at that summary sheet we put in the folder today for the opposite subcommittee on the results of the survey, so you can see where people are talking, what's being discussed. I think that would help that conversation move along as best we can. And if you have some time to look at those recaps, that's really why we're sending, so you don't walk into that conversation cold for the other side. And then we'll do our best, because of the way these are hitting. We'll do our best to give you a week with the draft language ahead of time. If not, maybe 6 days. So that's what we can commit to.
Cool. Thanks. And all right, y'all. Well, thanks, Jessica. Appreciate the quote in the chat. That's good. Okay. All right, y'all. Well, not seeing any requests for public comment. We're gonna get you out of here a little early. Really appreciate your hard work, your continued commitment. We are absolutely on a sprint, and I think we all feel that. So thank you for continuing to show up time and time again. We'll keep going. We're getting somewhere good. So thank you. Have a great rest of your week, and always reach out if you have any questions or feedback for us. Y'all take care.